are you so afraid of the world? Fascism. Dormus. Just a word. Just a word. It might not be so bad. With all the lazy bums, we got panhandling relief nowadays, and living on my income tax and yours, not so worse to have a real strong man like Hitler or Mussolini, like Napoleon or Bismarck in the good old days, and have them really run the country and make it efficient and prosperous again. In other words, have a doctor who won't take any back chat, but really boss the patient and make him get well whether he likes it or not. Yes. Didn't Hitler save Germany from the Red Plague of Marxism? I got cousins there. I know. Said Dormus, as often as Dormus did say it. Cure the evils of democracy by the evils of fascism. Funny therapeutics. I've heard of their curing syphilis by giving the patient malaria, but I've never heard of their curing malaria by giving the patient syphilis. That's just some nice language to use in the presence of Reverend Falk, raged Hasbro. Mr. Falk piped up. I think it's quite nice language, and an interesting suggestion, Brother Dormus Jessup. Besides, says Hasbro, this chewing the rag is all nonsense anyway. As Crowley says, might be a good thing to have a strong man in the saddle, but it just can't happen here in America. And it seemed to Dormus that the softly moving lips of Reverend Mr. Falk were framing, the hell it can't. This comes from the last few paragraphs in It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis in the second chapter, the book that we're going to delve in today. Hello and welcome back to the library, and before we get lost amongst the stacks, I want to introduce my guest today, the People's Farmer, the Burlington Gaucho, the avant-gardener agronomist himself, Nour Noah el-Naboulsi. Hello, Nour.
Hello. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. That was, I don't know if I've ever been introduced so pleasantly, so I appreciate that coming from you, Phil.
Yeah, no problem. I feel like you deserved all those nicknames. We have a funny gag on this series where we just give each other ridiculous nicknames. This is a topic that we both brought up a couple times about a book that we wanted, and after suggesting it, I'm glad that you were totally on board of reading It Can't Happen Here. Because, I mean, at this point, this book is referenced by so many different people, different types of people with different mediums, for many different valid and sometimes invalid reasons. This is a book I first read during the first Trump administration, shortly after finishing the book called Babel. I've been fascinated by this author, Sinclair Lewis, for a while, not only because I mixed him up with Upton Sinclair, but also because he was one of America's most decorated authors and one who, at this point, is not really spoken of much except for when we're referencing this book in particular now, which is kind of a shame, but It Can't Happen Here really is a great piece of literature, and on this episode, we will be getting into some of the background on how this novel was written, why it was written, and what was going on in the world generally, in the United States specifically, when it was published, and why all of it is important today.
Yeah, and I would just say that I really did enjoy reading it, and when you first asked to have me on, I knew it was going to be something along those lines. We're both big history nerds, but I was like, man, maybe there is an off chance that Phil gives me some light summer reading to get the season going. But here's where we are, and I'm not mad about it.
Yeah, no late summer reading here. Without getting too deep into his life, though, we'll talk about Sinclair Lewis, because this writer will be a biographical episode of itself one of these days, because he is one of the top 5 in my view, personally, and I'm a little too intimidated to do podcasts of people I really enjoy thoroughly, like that Hutch, but shortly put, Harry Sinclair Lewis was born on February 7th, 1885, in a very small town called Sauk Center, I think that's how you pronounce it, in Minnesota, in the U.S. of A. Yeah, we have a little Quinny here, too, as well. You want to say something, Quinny? Yeah, no worries, Quinn. I understand. Sinclair Lewis grew up in an interesting part of American history, and I put interesting in quotations here. He was born at a time when this part of the country he had grown up was just developing into its own regional culture, which we now know as the Midwest, but in his own writings they referred to it as the Middle West, which is not as catchy, right? The expulsion in mass migration of the native population started around the 17th century, but the historical event where one could really refer to as the last forced migration happened after the Dakota War in 1862. Only 23 years before he was born, and the migration of American settlers as well as German and Scandinavian immigrants to the land, was happening throughout the 19th century at this point, the later half of it at least. This can't be an exhausted history of the town, but let's leave this. Sauk Center was decided as a name because of a lottery system. The name got picked up at random from like around a dozen other names, and Sauk refers to a group of people who originally come from eastern Michigan and Green Bay, Wisconsin, notably not in the center of Minnesota, which was inhabited probably by the Dakotas or possibly the Ojibwa, excuse me. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's dumb for a lot of reasons.
It is. I'm not sure if I like it less than just picking anywhere in England and naming towns. So, yeah. It's different.
Yeah, it's different as we sit in St. Albans, Vermont, right? Sauk Center really is a small town in America, very similar to where I would live in right now, right? It's got roughly the same population, and its economy is largely agricultural, not as much as it used to be, but it's still agricultural in the most mega farm way you could possibly think of it. So a young Sinclair got the fuck out of town as soon as he could, eventually ending up at Yale. He was not a Yale upper crust, of course, coming from basically being a country bumpkin and didn't really match up to the high society. This, I think, is one of the reasons why he wrote about the things he did. Nour, I am going to skim some of his works now. His first real commercial success was a book called Main Street, which depicted Midwest America, with all the nuanced and unwritten rules satirizing small-town America in a way U.S. readers have never really heard before. His next book, after Main Street, it was another satirical portrayal of the Midwest voting man who switches political parties and ideologies based on how the vibe is going, basically, as well as making fun of boosterism, which sounds like boomerism because it basically is. It boosts one small town as the most important place in the world, even though there's nothing going on there. Many of his next books are satirical pieces of American society, and not just the Midwest, but also highbrow New Englanders and corrupt, hypocritical evangelical preachers. He writes about progressive ideas, though admittedly he wouldn't use the same words or language as we do today, basically, and had several books where the protagonist was a powerful female espousing feminist concepts, which he also personally believed in. His tongue-in-cheek writing style, as well as how thoroughly he calls out people and pokes fun of a character, town, or action while including contemporary real-life people, places, and ideologies, made him not only financially successful as an author, but he became the first American writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1930. Isn't that interesting?
Quinn is nodding vigorously.
So, Nour, this is the point of the podcast where we start glossing over historical events and yada, 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 a bunch of important facts that pertain to the creation of this book. But before I continue, do you have any questions about Sinclair Lewis? Because, as I stated, I want to get into his life in a separate day, but just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I'll look forward to hopefully being invited for that one, because I am now, my interest is peaked. I didn't really look into him, but the fact small town farm background, going to Yale and kind of being the outsider, it's piecing together. But yeah, I'm ready to dive in.
Yeah. Well, imagine it's the year 1930. I'd say it is difficult to imagine that in the past, but we'll unveil why we shouldn't. Because right now, the stock market just crashed a few months ago because rich people made bad investments, and then they tried to blame it on middle-class Americans for buying too many new appliances on credit. Okay, that part was actually kind of part of the reason, but you can't take an economy because too many new appliances were sold on people who can't have enough credit, like similar to how you can't basically tank an entire economy by middle class people just purchasing subprime mortgages. There are other factors involved. Loads of people are being laid off, partially because the government, and there is also virtually no help coming out of the administration at this point. Remember, this is 1930 and not talking about today, because, well, they're political and ideological. They're just incapable of feeling empathy, as they believe it's your fault that you are poor. Mass layoffs, high rents, little need, and a group of disenfranchised people flood the streets as homelessness soars. The middle class is being deteriorated. People are complaining about all new homeless. Where did they even come from? Can't they just get jobs? Why do they have to live here? Does any of this sound similar? Nearly a third of the population ends up being unemployed. As much as it sucks right now, the Great Depression was just an absolute nightmare to live in. But maybe we will get there. I don't know. A third of all unemployed people is pretty crazy, though. The wealth of the 1920s in the U.S. of motherfucking A had no part in Sinclair Lewis's success as an author. The 5 or more satirical books he wrote about normal American life and wealth and culture just wasn't as humorous anymore for people. So people like basically were struggling genuinely, and this kind of literature was just no longer popular. The version of the book I own, by the way, is the Signet version classics, with afterword by Gary. Oh, I'm going to butcher this every single time. Scharnhorst, and an introduction by Michael Meyer. No relation to The Spy Who Shagged Me or West Milford's most prestigious night-fielding citizen. And sorry for getting on a divergence, but I was writing this literally right in the middle of the horrible murder spree in Minnesota, where 2 Democratic representatives were shot, and absolutely fucking loser of a human being. And I'm just like realizing that the mask he was wearing was strangely similar to like Michael Myers' masks from Halloween, which makes him even more of a loser. But in this divergence, when we get to the second part more specifically, the murder of Democrats kind of plays, well, of politicians, not Democrats necessarily, plays a huge role in the plot line. Sorry to be morbid, but, you know, pertinent to this book one way or another. And, of course, Michael Myers from West Milford is probably still their most prodigious son. Yeah. Have you seen the Halloween movies ever?
I love that. Nothing gets me more in the Halloween spirit than like 70s cult classics. I love those. That's an interesting tidbit about those murders, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it looks like it. I don't think he was actually wearing it, but like it's very similar.
Yeah.
I grew up in the town next to where those the movies were filmed in West Milford. It's still the part of New Jersey that's full of forests and stuff like that, but we would just like drive past the camp. It's like, that's like our backyard. Like, that's not remote, but it felt like it. But I didn't digress. Here's Michael Meyer, again, in no relation, how he writes the introduction. Quote, after the stock market crash of 1929, there wasn't much left in the middle class of the early 1930s. Many who were previously solid, respectable breadwinners found themselves on bread lines, soup lines, and relief rolls. Normalcy, as the 20s password synonymous with security, gave way to the jitters, as profitless corporations laid off millions of workers who drifted across the country like Oklahoma farm dust. End quote. He continues the next page. Quote, not surprisingly, the middle class was no longer interested in being discounted by bankers or by satirists. Lewis had to find new material. Given the stormy economic and social climate in the early 1930s, Lewis had plenty of other topics to consider that were more relevant than middle class predispositions to be foolish and venal. He found a ready-made plot in the nervous undercurrent that accompanied the volatile politics of the period. With the rise of Adolf Hitler, you may have heard of him, kind of plays a big role in this book, and Benito Mussolini, famous for his headstand, and the alarming popularity of a variety of demagogues from both the left and the right in the United States. There was widespread concern that the country could be taken over by fascist dictatorship, unquote. Paranoia. Right?
Paranoid, yeah, justified. I mean, just as will be the whole theme of today's conversation. Just it could be today. Everything that you're writing about, talking about, it's eerie.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, because back in the day, like, fascism wasn't just growing in continental European countries that we all know and hold dear in our collective unconscious for. Let's just say fundamentally making some erroneous decisions in leadership for at least the next few generations. Hopefully it is not going to last that long here. It spread like cancer in the 30s with movements such as far-right leagues and neo-socialism in France and Belgium, with the British of Union fascists led by the scumbag Oswald Mosley, who was if you know anything about Peaky Blinders, right? He was one of the main characters in the later seasons. Have you watched that show?
No, I haven't. It's been on my list.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those funny shows that like a lot of it is completely outrageous, but then like, oh wow, there's a lot of historical context in this that's like kind of interesting. Of course, fascism also hopped across the pond. Nearly every North American country had a fascist party of some kind, largely due to German immigrants, but not exclusively. Obviously, this includes Canada, Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and us. The far-right movement here literally took a deep dive in the U.S. of A. because, like, you know, anybody who is an American who has two brain cells connecting should understand how organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the institutional racism of Jim Crow and certain Supreme Court decisions made this country feckin' ground for political ideology like fascism. We should talk a little bit more about leading figures in the movements that occurred during the book, which we will and emphasize later. But any thoughts at the moment?
And you're mentioning kind of North America, Europe, and then you look at of course in like post World War I around the world, kind of this post-colonial era where basically England, France, not the U.S. right at this point, but soon enough are just carving up, like, let's say the Middle East and installing puppet dictators or installing yes men that's going to play into these proxies between the Ottomans and the Russians. So it's just like they are putting in place these fascist dictators that they hope are going to serve them in the long run. And again, whether this is the 30s or the teens, look at where we are now, how that has all worked out.
Yeah, very true. And I mean, Japan wasn't fascist per se, but it had a crazy dictatorship, right? I mean, that's its own history. Well, this script specifically, I'm going to try to construct a cohesive narrative regarding events that were happening right before the book was published, like a few years. So this is going to be simplified. Particularly, I'm going to run through a series of events that happened where a group of people within the United States made serious efforts to overthrow the government to install an outright dictatorship. You may have already heard about this, but there was a little scrap, like you just mentioned, called, in the theoretical years of 1914 and 1918, which was World War the prequel. It took a couple of years of throwing a generation of European men into a meat grinder, but eventually the United States said, gee whiz, that looks like a shit ton of fun. Let's join their party. True to the form, this war led to a large group of veterans of a completely nonsense war trying to make sense of why they were sent to die because inbred cousins who happened to had honorific titles such as king or czar were beefing over turf. This was more prevalent in Europe, of course, but it also led to what we now know as the Lost Generation, who were specifically white men needing to find some kind of answer to this. We are going to be talking mostly about white men because of the era. Just want to acknowledge that. And since these veterans, or these people were veterans, they are also a massive political force because all veterans and soldiers are political, no matter if they vote or are vocal or not, period. Because politicians will always find a way to use soldiers and veterans as a means for their political gains. Because the war was fought in Europe, it would be also logical that the largest population of disenfranchised veterans were people in this nation. Many European countries struggled economically after the war, and some places like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist entirely. Politically speaking, the interwar period was a bit of a clusterfuck, a combination of disenfranchised political populace with serious wartime experience, probably chock full of undiagnosed PTSD, and almost certainly serious anger, does not make a society stable. You see, no fascist regime had been installed the same way. They have been installed similarly, but none of them are literally exactly the same. Governments like Vichy France and the Kingdom of Albania were installed by larger fascist governments during World War II, for example, but they had very different governmental systems and history about how they were occupied, and the government was overthrown was just vastly different, who was overthrown. Francisco Franco's fascist Spain had to fight and win a pretty goddamn brutal civil war to install its regime. One of these days we'll talk about this.
Boy,
right?
Oh boy.
Yeah, we both have enjoyed the literature out of this area. We're not talking Orwell, though. Greece's strongman dictator, Ioannis Metaxas, I think, was a political insider who rose to power after a lengthy political career as Minister of Public Transport, then the Interior, then the Defense, then Deputy Prime Minister, and finally Prime Minister, where he was suspended Parliament with the support of the constitutional monarch, King George II. No, not George Kokinis. He's never been a king. However, what all of these have in common, that's just a joke for us. Nobody else knows who he is.
Took me a second, too.
What I think is something that is somewhat abundantly lacking in the current political climate is the military intervention of some kind of a group of disenfranchised military vets or active soldiers fueled by national discontent who express their distaste in the current government's by violent actions, whether they were largely internal, like a nation who first implemented their fascist state, let's say like Italy, or they were external forces installing a regime like Vichy France. We just don't have that group of veterans right now. Those people at ICE are cosplayers, and so are the Proud Boys. That's something that I do want to make a distinction here. Any notes here?
Yeah, I mean, just when you were saying that, like, I guess I just think about, January 6th, the attempted insurrection, and it's like, I don't know, there are lots and lots of guns out there and very scary people, but I hope and I like to believe that something like whatever they were called in this book, or, Proud Boys don't get organized enough, spreading enough, that it's like this, this real armed monitoring unit. But like you said, ICE is kind of looking more and more like that.
Well, again, they're not battle-hardened people.
True.
They are just, they're terrorizing people. I wouldn't call them terrorists yet, but they are glorified abductors, kidnappers. As I mentioned previously, there was a large number of Great War veterans just kind of mucking around in Italy. And though all theaters of this war were pretty pointless, the Italian theater was particularly pointless, virtually beginning with and ending this war against Austria-Hungary with gaining no ground whatsoever. It was bloody, brutal fighting in the Alps. Particularly important to our story were the shock troops, or the stormtroopers called the Arditi, who were trained specifically for a life of violence and war. Benito Mussolini was not a member of the Arditi at all. However, he certainly was a veteran of the war and was discharged himself after being wounded by an accidental explosion of a mortar in the trench. He was able to portray his sympathy and speak to this particular group of veterans, and they quickly joined his anti-communist Italian first rhetoric shortly after the war. And they would later form the Black Shirts, who, before they were empowered politically, were basically a roving group of thugs causing street brawls and with people who they didn't believe shared their line of political bullshit. There was often killings too. Meanwhile, the first years after the end of the first time the world went to war all at once, or that's what my history teachers told me, was not a stable period in Italy politically. The government was weak and terrible at managing the civil unrest that kept popping up. This was a witch's cauldron of how to stir up strongman sentiment. El Duce organized a number of strikes and speeches, and fascists began winning in local elections finally during a speech on the 24th of October, 1922, Mussolini spoke in Naples, declaring that they want to rule all of Italy. He began organizing a march, appointing someone else to lead it as he fucked off to Milan just to do whatever you did in Milan, probably attended a fashion show. And then a few days later threatened the then prime minister that his followers were fully prepared to seize Rome if they did not capitulate and give him power to the country. Around 30,000 men did march onto Rome, and El Duce himself was not one of them, though the king ended up handing power to him directly. Of course, most are familiar with Nazi Germany, and the summary will really infuriate a lot of the people because of its oversimplification, but I'm going to just push right on because it's the first real effort to overthrow the government was a failure during the Beer Hall Putsch, when the Nazis tried to pull basically one of their own marches on Rome. This failed. Hitler went straight to jail, but was later released. And because he became the head of the Nazi Party, running for elections several times until winning, because of this, he ended up winning the parliamentary election for the first time on July 31st, 1932, with only 37% of the total vote. Now, only 37% of the total vote sounds low, but for German elections at the time and the present day, that's actually pretty common. Now, It Can't Happen Here follows more closely of what happens to Germany and also U.S. state after a certain governor gets elected, which we will talk about who that governor is, but I wanted to provide the context on the March of Rome because, well, we'll talk about why. Any questions so far?
No, it's a lot, but you're doing a good job putting the pieces of the messy fascist puzzle together. So I'm with you.
It is messy. So is the pages that I've apparently printed out. All these ink stains are actually making this very difficult to read. So hopping across the pond here again, the U.S. also had its fair number of World War I veterans who were trying to make sense of why they fought over there, specifically because they didn't live over there, and also trying to make sense just like how they're going to make a living. True to form, the U.S. also didn't keep their end of the bargain to these veterans. Specifically, they didn't pay them the bonuses that they were promised after enlisting in the military to serve in the Great War. At least not yet, you know. These bonuses were supposed to be paid in 1945. However, there's literally a thing called the Great Depression, and people who were broke and hungry, they wanted their money, and they needed it now. And somehow I highly doubt they could go ahead and call J.G. Wentworth 877 cash now. Okay.
Good one.
Okay, all right, there you go. I was waiting for that. I honestly thought that this, like, J.G. Wentworth.
J.G. Wentworth
877 cash now.
I got you.
Yeah. I thought it was just a Jersey thing, but apparently, like, it's beyond the greater New York City metro area. My wife knew what I was talking about when I said this. But I digress. Also true to form, like, we'll talk about what happens here right now, but, I'll just save this for later. In 1932, 3 years before this book's publication, the veterans organized and eventually amassed 43,000 demonstrators, 17,000 of them being veterans of World War the Uno, and basically camped in Washington, D.C. until they got their due. That's what their plan was. They developed a Hooverville. Then the police killed a couple of people, and, surprise, surprise, the police killing a couple of protesters. And the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, called in the army to disperse the protesters. Any of this sound familiar to you?
All too familiar. Also, it is interesting that you make the note that kind of these disenfranchised veterans, that they leave these wars, and you see this today still, they leave these wars, these families who have been missing them, losing them, etc., seeing them deteriorate, come back, and our government, just like anybody else, without money, without riches, gets left behind. They don't get their end of the bargain held up. But as you noted, they have to think that what they lost their life, their limb, their mental health was for something. So instead of joining us for the voice of anything socialist or anything caring and empathetic, they, think, and their families, their community members think that this can't have been for nothing. So they lean into the patriotism. They lean into the endless wars because, again, then you're like, oh, what, you killed people? You wasted your life? For not, it's hard for them to face that, obviously. So oftentimes they lean in this opposite direction. Every now and again you see veterans that kind of see through that and join onto the other side, but oftentimes not.
Absolutely. It's really well said. And just being that in the sport that we play for, in rugby, you see a lot of veterans. It's a sport in the United States, at least, that has a huge veteran population. And like, I'm always like on the somewhat controversial way of saying, let's just make no new veterans. No new veterans is the best way of doing it, but that's a pacifist way of doing it.
Yep. And
if we're going to do it, let's absolutely treat them in the way that they should be treated. If you believe in this concept that they are fighting for our freedom, and they fought for our freedom and our democracy, then, if they gave us everything that you're saying, they should be treated better than just a discount at the movie theater.
Yeah, they're humans who have been through some horrific stuff, and you want to
fund the VA, right?
Yeah, fund the VA, things like that, exactly. And, not just for altruism, for taking care of them just as humans, which is good too, but also because then you don't want these people with PTSD and experience in, weaponry and stuff in war to not have mental health issues addressed and then potentially take it out in really, really scary ways. So
yeah, I mean, you had a violent group of people with heavy PTSD overthrow the Italian government.
Yep.
Yeah. So going back to the script, Army Chief of Staff, I don't know if this name is familiar to you, Douglas MacArthur, was all too happy to use military intervention on veterans, and the bonus marchers, along with all their wives and children, because remember, they were probably destitute and needed to bring all their families with them pretty much wherever they went. Because what else are they going to do? They were eventually dispersed without getting any pay, but where are their families going to go, right? They're going to go with them. A year later, another bonus march was reformed. This time, FDR was the president. Now, FDR didn't just simply hand them the money they were promised. Instead, he explained that they'd still get what they were owed when the time comes in 1945, and then offered them work under the Civilian Conservation Corps. He did this because this is a very shrewd political move, because while the marchers didn't get what they desired exactly, the compromise was both financially and meaningful in a resolution in the sense that they got good work. So FDR could claim he resolved the issue while promoting one of the core programs of the New Deal. It also provided some like financial leeway for the government, because giving everybody their bonuses would have been very, very expensive right off the bat. I don't know if this was the best move. Maybe they should have just gotten their bonuses, but most marchers chose to take the CCC route, and those who didn't were provided passage home and paid for. This may shock people, but a bill was passed by Congress, and then Congress overrode FDR's veto in 1936 to eventually give these bonuses to the vets, which is unheard of politically today, right?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, 2/3 of a majority said, fuck you, FDR. This is a little ahead of our story, but because the book was published before this, but it's important in the context that Congress probably knew that they didn't want to fuck around with a bunch of disgruntled vets that, at that point they saw what was happening in other countries. I didn't want to add the bonus army just for fun, because it really is key to what happens next. And I didn't add this in the script per se, but the United States has a fucking long history of fucking over vets and not paying them their due. It literally begins in the Revolutionary War. And that was one of the first uprisings that occurred, was after we didn't pay Revolutionary War veterans any money. So it's just the history of this country with vets. I'm going to pivot to the business plot. Woo, woo, skeet, skeet, ha, ha. Have you heard of the business plot? No. Or Skeet Skeet was fun. On July 1st, 1933, a retired Marine Corps general and a highly decorated war veteran with the improbable name of Smedley Butler answered a knock on his door. The individuals who visited him in Pennsylvania at his home came from the American Legion of Connecticut for some reason, which is one of the many organizations comprised mostly of war veterans. At first, they asked him to do small tasks like run for the national commander of the American Legion, urge the U.S. to return to the gold standard, speak out against the strikes that are happening. However, these requests kept progressing until finally in 1934, a wild scheme was proposed to Smedley. All those disenfranchised bonus army marchers, what if we were to say organize them and march onto Washington, D.C., and overthrow the newly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, installing somebody that would be, a little bit more friendly to big business interests. Smedley, at this point, was retired from a really nasty military service, really, helping the U.S. to occupy nations for business interests, fighting in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Banana Wars, and yes, this was real. The Banana Wars helped install banana republics in places like Nicaragua for the benefit of what we now know as Chiquita bananas. It was known something different at the time. And lastly, he fought in World War I. Even though he won 2 medals of honors for his service, he was starting to rethink that maybe all the time he was in the army, he was just a gangster for capitalism. And those are his direct words, not mine. And after being approached by veterans to try to overthrow a democratically elected president of the United States for a handful of business interests, well, that really just wasn't his thing.
Interesting that they would even go to him. Yeah, because I was trying to figure out
Well, they chose him because of his history, right?
Yeah. Interesting, huh? And he was, like we just talked about, one of the maybe, I don't want to say few, but one of a certain percentage of those veterans who does see through all the propaganda of what the horrible things they've been through on behalf of a government that actually doesn't really care about them either.
It took a while, definitely, but he did become one of those people. He basically immediately called people he knew in the press, and within months he was testifying before a congressional committee. Now, the committee ultimately found that there was not enough proof to arrest any U.S. citizen or implicate any foreign government in the business plot. However, there are many high-end executives and wealthy elites who were tied directly to the plot. The most important one, I think, to the present day is none other than Prescott Sheldon Bush Sr., the father of George Herbert Walker Bush and the grandfather of George Walker Bush. So, yeah, he was the direct ancestor of two of America's, worst presidents.
Wow.
He also was known to have shady dealings with the Nazis and then also Stalin's USSR. Just to let you know a little bit more about the shadowy.
This is still Smedley?
This is Prescott Bush.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
So like
runs in the family.
Coming back to the author of It Can't Happen Here, Sinclair Lewis was connected to American politics from a young age. He won the Nobel Prize for his satirical portrayals, after all, so he was in tune definitely with how Americans thought. It makes sense that after he won arguably literature's greatest award, he just decided to say, fuck it, I'm going to write write about one of our greatest perceived evils at the time and at our lifetime as well. It clearly can happen here, just in the most American way possible, and that's what he wrote. And did it work preventing the rise of fascism? Well, not really, and not surprising at all, because the type of disenfranchised, mostly middle-class conservative wasn't really reading his books, nor were the people who were just straight-up racist pigs looking to hurt somebody who is different from them while thinking that if people who didn't look like me are hurting, that must mean that I'm benefiting in wealth somehow, surely. Organizations like the German-American Bund became more popular until World War II, and this organization had direct ties with Nazi Germany, and they even had Hitler youth camps pop up across America at this time, one of the largest camps being in Camp Norland. You want to guess what state that was in, Nour?
I don't even... in Norland?
Camp Norland.
No, I don't know.
Nordland. So Nordland.
Yeah. No, Minnesota?
In our home state of New Jersey.
Oh, all right.
In Sussex County. It's still kind of, I wouldn't say the middle of nowhere, but it's like southwestern Sussex County.
Yeah.
Yep. We won't talk too much about the rise of fascism that happened after the book because it really isn't super relevant for the context, but about why this book was first important in its writing. However, it's important to note that the German-American Bund had a pro-America rally in February of 1939 at Madison Square Garden where 20,000 American Nazis attended. Counter-protesters then formed, and when the rally took to the streets, you want to know what side the police were on?
I'm going to guess it's on the side of the Nazis.
Yep. The Bund was popular until Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And some of these fascists ended up being disgraced, but far fewer than you would expect. We're going to need to pivot pretty hard here and talk about two U.S. figures in particular who Sinclair Lewis drew many resemblances to characters and speeches made in the book. And one of them wasn't necessarily fascistic, while the other absolutely praised Mussolini in Nazi Germany. But before we get into them, because they are super relevant, as I said just a second ago, do you have any thoughts or comments before we move on?
Nope. No. Good to move on.
Like I mentioned, we are going to talk about one of the messiest of mixed bags of people you could possibly think of. He's a Louisiana politician mentioned in the books directly named Huey Long. Huey Long, is that familiar?
Yes, I can't have any details, but it definitely does ring a bell.
Yeah, people, anybody who is paying attention to American history classes probably knows the name Huey Long, because Huey Long was actually, the person that Sinclair Lewis believed would be the person who could potentially lead a fascist insurrection in the United States. We will also discuss why this wasn't crazy, nor would he be a bad guess who could do it. However, he never really got the chance to, and we'll begin talking about it right now. At least I'm going to summarize this guy's insane political career in a couple of pages.
Did he have some crazy Louisiana prison scheme almost, or something? Wanting to increase, or I don't know.
He did have that. We're not talking about the prison scheme. The scheme was honestly, for a politician in Louisiana, wasn't abnormal. That's not the weird part about this. He was one of America's most fascinating, competent, and frightening politicians to ever live. Huey Long was born on August 30th, 1893, near Winfield in Louisiana, which is a really small town in north central Louisiana. Basically, everybody in the Long family would eventually get into politics at some point, some more successful than others, and some more sane than others. Huey was a natural salesman from a young age. Schooling was really not for him, though, as he always wanted to be a lawyer, but he couldn't go through school. Then he got elected to a political office. Once he did that, he wanted to become a governor, and eventually he always wanted to become the president, and that was what he wanted to do, always. Huey attended Tulane Law School and only took a few classes, or the classes that he knew he would help him pass the bar. Then he petitioned the state Supreme Court to just make an exception for him himself to be able to take the bar exam without receiving the necessary number of credits, which they allowed him to do somehow, and he became a lawyer at the age of 21. A lot of balls.
Yeah.
That guy has to probably walk with a freaking wide stance with that number, like that massive fucking sack he's got. He would take cases no matter what. He would just take the ones that nobody wanted to do, and he would honestly not make a lot of money. At first, it was just for the notoriety, but also because he was genuinely empathetic for many people and wanted to help them. Huey was a champion of the little guy. He got into the politics and got elected to his first position on the Louisiana Railroad Commission, which was much more important back in 1915 when he got elected. That same year, he passed the bar, obviously, and he also ran for this position, going back to this, because there was no age restriction. I mean, he was 21. He did this with a combination of tireless campaigning using a new technology as well called speakers, which was a bit of a faux pas at the time. People didn't campaign like this, especially not for a lowly position, and not with speakers, as well as whipping out the rural votes in Louisiana at the time. It was very difficult to do. Then he ran for governor twice before getting elected. During his campaigns, he would call the sitting governor things like a stooge for big business. He vilified Standard Oil, which was the largest business in the state of Louisiana at the time. Standard Oil was Rockefeller's oil company. And he whipped up populist leftist votes. He was genuinely a leftist. He's not a conservative. Once elected, he promised free textbooks to all students regardless of which school they attended. Specifically, public and Catholic schools were the ones that he was talking about because Louisiana, large Catholic minority here, right? He also instituted a 5-cent per barrel oil tax on all Standard Oil barrels because he had a huge grudge on Standard Oil, which is really petty. If you were on his bad side, he made sure that you paid, and promised to pave every road in Louisiana, which at the time had the largest percentage of unpaved roads, which I think Vermont might have in the continental United States, but we do that intentionally at this point. If you pave the roads in this state, they would just crack and deteriorate. It's absolutely no fucking point. He also did shady shit like firing basically everybody who was appointed by the previous governors and appointed sycophants, with the exception of specific roles that required significant expertise that could not be easily replaced. Something that our current government basically had to learn the hard way. And a lot of his tactics on how he got legislation passed wasn't legal as well. He forced bills through the Senate and House by basically strong-arming people by calling special legislative sessions knowing that certain people wouldn't be there, and intimidating and mocking people who didn't agree with him constantly. I mean, this guy was the definition of a bully at times. This, as well as a number of other shady shit he did, which called for his impeachment. But the vote never occurred, as Huey was able to whip up public sympathy, as well as some of the stuff that he was being impeached for wasn't actually illegal. An example of this was they have this concept of the Southern gentleman, and Huey didn't fit into it. So one charge was he called somebody a son of a bitch. So, right. Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, and then they said it on at the court, and everybody blushed. It's a really funny scene thinking about it.
Colonel Sanders fainting in the audience.
After impeachment, well, at least the trial, he then ran for Senate, as governors can only get elected for one term in Louisiana, according to their constitution back then. I don't know if that's the case now, but they're able to run after a second term. So they're able to run for multiple terms, but you have to wait another period, which, whatever. I guess that works. I don't know. I don't know how you can continuously function as a government when you're doing that, but whatever. He was elected based on his populist left-wing campaign. He won, which meant that he would also he'd have to leave governor's seat early, that year, right? That's part of their constitution. You can't be a senator or have a federal position and be the governor at the same time. But Huey didn't give a fuck. He didn't like the lieutenant governor because the lieutenant governor supported his impeachment, and he decided to hold both offices illegally for the year just to spite the man. It was pure spite. And we'll talk about why, but he could have, if it was somebody else who was a sycophant, he would have let that happen. In fact, even after he was only senator, he would come back to Louisiana as technically a private citizen, barge into the state house, and continue to dictate what legislation was passed in the state. He was able to do this because during his tenure as governor, the short tenure, he developed a large group of politicians who would basically do anything he said, because basically having his name as support on your ticket would have meant that you automatically got elected.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because he was the one person that could turn up the rural votes and stuff and actually get people out. Yeah.
Of course, him coming to the legislation and strong-arming them to pass bills was highly illegal, but it didn't stop him. In 1933, he announced also that he wanted to cap fortunes at $100 million, limiting the annual income to $1 million and cap individual inheritance at $5 million nationally. Today, this is around $2.5 billion, $2.5 million in income limit, and $125 million in inheritance when it adjusted to inflation, which is pretty rad, right? Imagine getting all that taxes from these people. Why would you need more than $2 billion?
This is before Red Scare. People weren't coming after, slandering him as a communist and all this stuff, and really coming after him. Or
this was before the heat of the 50s, Red Scare. But communism is definitely being hounded. And I mean, he was a socialist. He was a leftist for sure. In 1934, he then went on the radio to broadcast his Share Our Wealth program. This was a guarantee that every family would have a basic grant of $5,000 and a minimum income annually of $2,000 provided by the federal government. He basically did a UBI before anybody else.
All right, Huey. I kind of like him at this point. Yeah. I mean, other than the shady dealing stuff, but I mean, this stuff I like. The UBI stuff I like.
I mean, he is a messy mixed bag. Yeah, he really is. Yeah. There's things about him where I go, damn, dude, if only you just chilled a little bit.
Yeah.
Another reason why this is very important, because that $5,000 basic grant is something that is expressly taken and put into the fascist politician running for president, his campaign, Buzz Windrip, in Can't Happen Here. Yeah. Huey Long helped campaign for FDR originally, backing the New Deal, but eventually they had a falling out when Huey openly began criticizing the New Deal for not going far enough, and then FDR responded by putting his political opponents in charge of federal funds for the state of Louisiana because FDR didn't fuck around. FDR believed Huey was a demagogue openly, and he wasn't wrong, because in 1935 he announced that he was going to start running for president against FDR and began to whip a populist support campaign throughout the country, portraying himself as the folksy candidate that doesn't pretend he is any kind of an educated man. He's just a simple, normal American, similar to Buzz Windrip in the book.
Yep.
Huey didn't believe he would win against FDR in 1936 originally, but what he did believe is he'd be able to split the vote enough running as a third-party candidate and that the Republicans would win, and the economy would continue to tank under the GOP, and that would be enough time for him to gain support nationwide, similar to how he ran in his first gubernatorial campaigns. Huey's campaign slogan was, quote, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown," unquote, to which Sinclair revised the slogan for Buzz Windrip's campaign to, quote, Every man is a king so long as he has someone to look down on.
Yeah.
Yep, isn't that kind of sad now?
It is, and it's so true. Poor white Americans have been riled up with a scapegoat to, punch down upon any other race, rather than to actually look at the capitalist monster and, rich corporations that run our politicians and run our government. So rather than direct that anger at those people, they're provided with these otherisms and this division that it's better to punch down than to kind of look up and really see the puppet strings.
Yeah. This is where also Huey's tactics become a little bit more fascist. They take a turn. In September 1935, under his strong arming tactics, he got a bill passed that would authorize Louisiana to imprison anyone who infringed on the powers reserved to the state of Louisiana that was reserved from the 10th Amendment, which basically states that any power that isn't federally provided through for any kind of law goes directly to the states. It's a cool clause, theoretically speaking, if you think about states' rights in that way. However, it's also not a cool clause if you think about what states do with that right, and also how, the federal government is completely fucking ignoring it right now. He also pushed a bill that would gerrymander the shit out of Louisiana so badly that basically none of his political enemies would get elected. All of this was too much. And while walking down the state house in Baton Rouge, he was shot. He later died of his wounds that morning. His assassin, I think he was 42. This guy lived a fucking quick life.
Yeah.
His assassin, on the other hand, was killed by Long's bodyguards, which their nickname were the Cossacks or the Skull Crushers, which is, if you have a bunch of bodyguards called the Skull Crushers, there's some history there. They shot the assassin at least 60 times. That's 60. Dark. Huey Long died only a month before the publication of the book, so the book did not have any influence on his murder. At that point, publication was about to happen, and I think Sinclair Lewis made the right decision of not changing what the main antagonist was about. Any questions about Huey Long before, we got about a page and change of the first script?
No, that's great, and I did not know that Buzz Windrip was maybe not entirely based off, but this relation to a real figure, Huey Long. So I appreciate that context.
Yeah, I'll add that it's not just Huey Long. Hitler obviously he's based partially on him and his tactics, as well as a little bit of Mussolini, but more so they were talking about Hitler at the time
with an American country twist, right? Like I noted here something. How different Buzz is from the raving fascists like Hitler and Mussolini, where you have touches of Hitler and Mussolini, right? But also there's this idea that poor rural class Americans are very independent, and in a lot of ways they don't want a government coming down on them, so they're not going to respond as much to, I think, in some ways, as Hitler or Mussolini really rabbling up this group that's for the country, for the nation, which in part it is, but still it's no, it's more for you as, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, not this. So I think there are these, like you said, it's touches of Hitler and Mussolini, but with this, I'm just an honest working country boy that pulled myself up from the bootstraps, and you can do that too. It's
perfectly said. Yeah, and we'll talk about the way that he made the fascist dictator and the overthrow of fascist America very American in the next the episode for sure. Because we're going to just delve into the book next. We're not going to do too much context. But before we do that, we got to talk about one of America's most controversial people in the 1930s. And surprise, surprise, we're going to be talking about a Catholic priest. We're going to be talking about Father Charles Coughlin specifically. Nor have you ever heard of Father Coughlin?
No.
This guy kind of got swept under the rug. Unfortunately, more people need to know about them because he's the type of person that if more people knew about that this figure existed from the get-go, it'll it'll brighten up, like it'll enlighten people about how we have insane people similar to him nowadays. To put this one's going to be a lot briefer because the person that he directly influences in the book doesn't survive very long. But Father Coughlin out and out supported a ton of fascist ideology. He was born in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, of all places, which he joins the milieu of dickhead right-wing Canadians who come to the United States and espouse right-wing nutjob ideology. Cough, cough, Ted Cruz. Being a Catholic priest, however, he could not get elected to any position, nor do I really think or should claim that he really wanted to. He was a priest by the time he was 25 and was assigned to the National Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak, Michigan. There, he began to broadcast on the radio his sermons in response to anti-Catholic sentiment that was growing globally. At first, he backed FDR and the New Deal, but then accused him of being friendly to the bankers. He established, and the globalists, by the way. He didn't use the word globalists, but to international bankers. We'll tell you what the international bankers were as anti-Semitic as he was saying. Yeah. He established a political organization called the National Union for Social Justice, and the membership of this union ran in the millions, though candidly, the historians say we were largely disorganized and disenfranchised workers, so they would never really have any political power in a very concentrated way, different to what the Minutemen were in the book. However, the late 30s, he started directly attacking Jews on his radio program, which the radio program was called the Golden Hour for some reason, which every time I read that, I think of Golden Shower, but that might just be me thinking about priests. He became increasingly anti-Semitic and increasingly more supportive in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy throughout his program. He used his weekly newspaper to serialize the entire protocols of the Elders of Zion. Are you familiar with that book at all?
No, I probably should be.
I mean, all you need to know is that it was anti-Semitic, horrible, like anti-Jewish propaganda produced by Tsar Nicholas the First, I think, or it was by the Akhrana, the people who were the Tsar's secret service in order for them to have like a scapegoat with the Jews. And like, you want to hear about like the worst kind of like anti-Semitic like conspiracy theories. It almost all originates in this book. It's a complete fabrication too. People believed it though, like they believe in the flat earth conspiracy or that for whatever reason.
Or like they still believe in anti-Semitic conspiracies.
Yeah. I was going to say like COVID or, gave you 4G or whatever. But, it's a little less absurd when you're like talking about anti-Semitic forgeries that are absolutely nuts. He was at the zenith of his popularity when World War the Dose broke out and his broadcast was shut down by the government. He basically vanished from the public afterwards and just became a priest at the National Shrine of the Little Flower, where he would die at the tender age of 88. But like many right-wing shitheads with microphones, he was able to whip up public sentiment to a horrifying degree. He's important not only because he's directly mentioned and it can't happen here, but also because the character Bishop Paul Peter Prang is modeled off of him. That's a fun alliteration test. Bishop Paul Peter Prang. And the League of Forgotten Men, which was the club in the book, is modeled loosely off of National Union for Social Justice. Before Huey Long's death, Father Coughlin began to laud Huey's work and backed him in his political campaigns. If Huey wasn't assassinated, one can easily presume and make the jump that they would continue to have this relationship, and his broadcast reaching millions of people would have been a real problem for FDR's campaign.
Yeah, interesting. And what year was Huey Long assassminated?
35.
Yeah,
36.
to then see how that would have shaped the U.S.'s role in World War II, and
Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I don't know Huey Long's position against like Germany or like what would happen if we were attacked. Huey Long wasn't wasn't a Nazi, right? Like he was starting to do fascist things, but he wasn't a Nazi.
Yeah.
Father Coughlin might have been.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. To see who would win, have that tug of war in their relationship between and how much Coughlin's influence would have spun him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, also Hugh Long's an asshole, like in general, but he's interesting dude.
Asshole, but not a Nazi.
You might have the right to cast doubts on the leaps of logic of my stating of Sinclair Lewis wasn't just a socially conscious person, and he didn't write a book about that would point out that it can't happen here because it can't, right? Why would it be able to? Which the author of the introduction of my version points out that the title was actually taken from a typical remark Americans would say about the country falling into a dictatorship at the time. Even though Sinclair Lewis is now credited for coining this term, the impact of the book actually was minimal of the saying during its publication. The same author, Michael Meyer, again, no relation, writes that, quote, the novel gave shape to the free-floating anxieties that had consumed worried citizens for several years as the country stumbled through economic turmoil, desperately seeking solutions. Lewis was intimately familiar with these concerns because Dorothy Thompson, his second wife, had interviewed Hitler as a foreign correspondent in Berlin and had written a series of articles between 1931 and 35 warning Americans about the Nazi propaganda machine that masked the vicious persecution of Jews and the growing number of concentration camps designed to annihilate them. In addition to what he heard in the breakfast table, Lewis was very much aware of the many debates swirling around him in newspapers, journals, and books. By September of 1934, for example, the Modern Monthly featured a symposium titled, Will Fascism Come to America? That featured a number of leading intellectuals debating the question, unquote. So, to me, it's clear that Sinclair Lewis knew exactly what he was writing about and intentionally wrote about it. Myers also, where's the other question, right? How popular was the book when it came out, right? Myers states that the, quote, threat of fascism captured his readers' attention. It Can't Happen Here quickly became a national bestseller with 32,000 copies sold, but I might have missed a zero, so it could be as high as 320,000 copies were sold. I think it's only 32,000 sold in that, the short period of time. That's a huge amount of books for people reading at the point. So it was popular. And on the second part of this two-part series, we're going to do a deep dive in this book. Usually I try to avoid spoilers whenever we do a book podcast, but we're going to not do that here. We're going to try to just go over the themes and plot and try to think about things that we find super relatable today.
Yeah, I could have read the title, and the inside cover, and it's not as much a spoiler. It's going to happen, but you still read it for, the lead up to what is going to happen.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, I just think we'll probably talk a lot more about this, but I think the first thing that really fired me up reading the book was where someone says, oh, but it can't happen here, and Doremus, I believe, just rattles off. He's like, oh, it can't happen here where we've been lynching black people for the past X amount of decades, where we had slavery, where we do X, Y, and Z, and just go for a full couple pages just lists off oh, but it can't happen here, but we do all this terrible stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just sarcastically ripping his, his friend.
Yeah, I'm glad you did that because we did that original quote from the start of this script, right, is from that, basically right before that. Well, I'm going to do some sources and plugs really quick, and then we're going to take a quick break and move on. But obviously the book It Can't Happen Here, I already told you which version that is. 1934, The Plot Against America by Scott Hurton. Sinclair Lewis's fan site, ConnecticutHistory.org, on the business plot. NPR's article about how the Nazis took Manhattan by Sarah Keat Kramer. Some digital history articles about Roosevelt's critics. There's a great 6-part podcast series on Huey Long by the podcast Gadfly, and then a series of articles on Wikipedia, because I admittedly had to go broad strokes as possible here with a lot of these, which were Benito Mussolini, March on Road, Fascism in the United States, Sinclair Lewis, Huey Long, Father Coughlin, Prescott Bush, the Bonus March, Smedley Butler, Sock Center, and the Sock People. Now that my Patreon is Lost in the Library there. Also, any questions, please go to lostinthelibrarypodcast@gmail.com. Feel free to harass me all you want until I get a lawyer. Follow us on Instagram, again, Lost in the Library there. And I have a Substack, which is at Fil Deptula. Yeah, all of it's under development. Any last remarks?
How many listeners are you getting nowadays now that you've been, doing a few episodes here and stuff?
Great. I'm in the dozens of people who subscribe. Yeah. Yeah, I get some comments and emails here, but it's a slow, steady progress. And like realistically, like I don't do any marketing. Like,
Have people found you outside of like Vermont and friend groups and stuff? And
yeah, I got a new German listener who like
Wow.
starts commenting a lot, and like
Cool.
good for him. Yeah. Sorry, I curse so much. Apparently, my mom told me that, and this German listener said he wanted to curse as much as I did. I'm like, dude, just grew up in North Jersey.
True.
All right. Well, talk to you in a bit.